Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our webinar. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple logistics. So my name is Trisha Dugan. It is listed as Trisha Klingenberg over in the panelist section. I'm a recruiter in New York. And just to take you through a couple of logistics before we start, during this webinar, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A feature at the bottom right hand of the corner. You can send your questions to Emily Peer, who is on as well, and she's waving. All the questions that we get from you, we will try to answer towards the end of this webinar. And in the chance that we don't get to answer those questions, you can go ahead and send those to careers.ug@kearney.com, and we will answer them there. So thank you so much again for joining, and I'm actually going to pass it over to our panelists to kick us off this evening for our interview overview for our Road to Kearney webinar series.
Great, thanks, Trisha. So, like Trisha just mentioned, we are glad that you guys could join us for an overview of our interview process. We hope to give you guys some tips and tricks on how to ace the interviews, which include both a behavioral and a case interview, as well as how to do that in a virtual environment. And we'll be taking any questions you have at the end. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. We'll go through a fun fact or hobby that we picked up over quarantine as well. So Sarah, do you want to start? And we'll go down the line.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah Gerbach. I'm an associate out of the New York office. I would say probably the best skill I've gained in the last couple of months is how to make a really good margarita.
Hi everyone, I'm Alec Wobeck. I'm a senior analyst in our analytics practice based out of Chicago. Let's see, fun fact. I started doing virtual Spanish and Portuguese classes, so know a lot about COVID in Colombia and Brazil and how they're responding to that, which has been interesting, kind of comparing some of the similarities and differences there.
I can go ahead and go. Hey everybody, my name is Isaiah Bolden. I'm a business analyst based out of the Dallas office in the strategic operations practice. Fun fact about me, I'll change mine up. I'll say I love sports, and I think that's good to say just because COVID has given us a lot of bad things, but now we have NFL, NBA playoffs, and soccer at the same time, which is like amazing to me. So my weeks are always interesting. So I've appreciated that lately.
All right, my name is Orvi Vasudevan. I am a business analyst out of the Chicago office. I've been trying to soak up the last few weeks of summer and picking up tennis and trying to train for a half marathon. Yeah. All right, so to go over the agenda for what we're going to cover today, we'll start with the interview process and what it contains overall. Then we'll dive into the behavioral interviews and then general expectations on how to find success in that. Then we'll move over to the case interview and talk about what it is, the overall structure of it, different frameworks that you can take, and just general best practices, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A at the end. All right, so the interview process is designed to test 3 different pillars. That includes the behavioral interview, the case interview, and the presentation that is combined with it, as well as overall interactions and experiences that you have with your interviewers throughout the process. All of these are based off of the technical skills and build up to your interpersonal skills. And the goal of today is to help give you an overview on how you can best tackle each of these separately. So now I'll pass it off to Alec, who will take us into the behavioral interviews.
Thanks, Irby. So this year, of course, our interviews will all be virtual, including the second final round. And the format that we're going with is for your first round, you'll have a behavioral interview and a case interview, each for 45 minutes. And then in the second round, it's 1 behavioral and 2 case interviews. For those that put their preference for strategic ops or the analytics practice, you could expect your behavioral interviews to probe a little bit deeper on your experience in those areas. And then most likely at least one, if not both of your cases in the final round will be more focused on operations if you're a strategic ops person, or more quant heavy, analytical heavy if you're applying the analytics practice. Now, what is a behavioral interview? I'm assuming that probably everyone on this call has at least participated in one behavioral interview in their life, but it's just our way of making sure that we understand who you are as a person, your past experiences, what you've learned and gained from that, and then really what's your motivation to become a consultant? Why are you interested in Kearney? So trying to assess your abilities, what your potential is, and really if we think that you're a good fit for working here. And then we say that at the bottom, remember SAO. Some people learn this as PAR or the STAR method, but for these types of questions where it's telling about a past experience, you want to make sure that you give a brief overview of the scenario, dive into the action, so describe what you did, who you interacted with, if there are multiple stakeholders. You can expect some follow-up questions in this area. And then the last piece is make sure that you talk about the outcome. We want to know what the results are. If you have any numbers, make sure to mention it, but really don't forget this piece, because a lot of times people kind of gloss it over at the end, and we want to know what really happened after your work or as a result of this work. Next slide, please. And really what you'll find is that behavioral questions will generally fall into three categories. So the first one is the introduction question. This is the tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume. Pretty much 99% of interviews start off with one of these two questions. So a few tips here. Make sure that you start off with a brief overview of name, school, education. If you studied abroad, feel free to mention that as well. Then from there, go into describing 1 to 2 internships and 1 to 2 leadership roles. I would say give a 1-sentence summary of the role and then highlight maybe your most proud accomplishment from each. So for me, when I was going through recruiting, I would say I was a data analytics intern at SunTrust Bank, where my main role was analyzing data and coming up with insights for the wholesale bank. One project that I worked on was focusing on the sales pipeline and really improving the visibility and accuracy. So we were able to improve the accuracy by over 30% for $10+ million in opportunities. And then my boss took that work after I left and worked on spreading it to different areas of the bank. So you'll see in that example, it's just 2 to 3 sentences, keeping it kind of short and sweet. And then the last tip we have here is to tie in your personal story to why you're interested in Kearney. A lot of times people will kind of not really know how to finish this, so they'll mention their interests at the bottom, but I think it's really helpful to take 1 or 2 things from your past experiences and tie that to why you're a good fit for Kearney. So for me, I stressed that I really loved my experience working in analytics, and I was looking for opportunities to continue building on those skills. Or if you have international experience, the fact that we're a global firm and we have lots of opportunities in different regions. So really make sure you have this personal spin at the end that helps leave this good impression, since this is going to kickstart your interview. And last piece on this is just make sure that your answer is around a few minutes. There's no need to spend 7 to 8 minutes walking through your resume, unless you're an Olympic gold medalist or something really, really special. I doubt that you have enough content to keep your resume story that engaging. So I would even recommend going through this with a friend, or even in the mirror as uncomfortable as it may be, and timing yourself and making sure you're around that 2 to 4 minute mark. The next set of questions are these past experiences. So that's, tell me about a time you came up with an interesting solution to a problem, you ran into a conflict, or also what achievement are you most proud of? For these, spend no more than 30 seconds describing the situation. Think 2 to 3 sentences. We don't need the whole entire backstory. Just give a couple quick highlights. And then focus on describing the action you took in a structured manner. I think it's helpful to say, like, I view the problem in 3 different ways, or there are a couple steps that I took. There are a few people that I realized I needed to talk to, and then listing it out in a very structured way that's easy to follow. Lastly, make sure that you elaborate on both your quantitative and qualitative results. So, I think a lot of times people use projects from class in these stories. So quantitative, what was the outcome? Do you have a grade? Were you able to get a result that was much better or not seen before? And then qualitative, what was the outcome of that? Did your professor use it as an example? If you're mitigating a conflict, did you build a friendship out of a difficult situation? So really make sure you're not ignoring this last piece. And make sure that you prepare your stories, but don't recite them. Generally speaking, there's a few themes that you'll get asked about in different interviews. So leadership experience, conflicts, successes and failures. I think for each one of these, it helps to have maybe 2 or 3 stories in mind and have an idea of what the main actions and results were, so that you don't get thrown off by these questions. But at the same time, we don't want to feel like we're talking to a robot that is clearly has memorized a speech and is just going to give us this canned response. So have an idea, but don't over rehearse at the same time. The last type of questions are these personality questions, and I think that these can sometimes be more of a curveball. Like, how do you prioritize your schedule? Who is someone you admire and why? Tips here, if it's something that you've really never heard before, don't be afraid to ask for a few seconds, 30 seconds to think. I think generally speaking in interviews, it's always better to take a little bit of time within reason and come back with a really great answer versus rushing yourself into something that isn't a best representation of your work. And then also try to apply a structure here. A lot of times we ask these questions because they are very ambiguous, and consulting is about finding structures to ambiguous, hard questions. So what are the 2 or 3 relevant criteria that you use for your answer? If you're prioritizing your schedule, I think the obvious thing is obviously due dates, but are you working with other people versus individual tasks? Is something maybe a one-off, you're finished and you're done, whereas the other thing has another assignment that's built off of it. So really explain those elements and make sure that it's a multifaceted response. And the last piece here is make sure that you're both original and authentic. If you have, personal answers, feel free to share them. We want to get to know you as a person. And then also just, keep in mind for especially questions like who's someone you admire and why, you want to make sure that your answer stands out a little bit here. So I went to an engineering school. Everyone would say that they admired Elon Musk at Georgia Tech and give a very similar response. So I think just kind of keep that in mind where it's, not saying that you should mention Elon Musk, but maybe make sure that what you're saying is, perhaps a little bit more stand out for these types of questions. Generally speaking, if it's something that is a really easy answer that a lot of people can think of, I would, again, try to take those 30 seconds and then think of something that is going to make the interviewer really remember you. All right, so I think that's all we have for the behavioral piece. Let me pass it off to Isaiah to go through cases.
Hey, everybody. Isaiah here. I'll be walking you through just a quick overview of what a case interview is and then just how to structure yourself better. And then Sarah will help close us out on the case interview piece with going over the approach frameworks and then also what are the best practices for note-taking. So the first thing that you'll need to know is it's okay to relax. Case interviews are typically the part where everybody finds it to be the most difficult. But I think if you understand how to structure yourself and you understand what they're looking for and why they're looking for it, it'll help you kind of relax a little bit and take some of that pressure off yourself. Because I know I was sweating when I was in there, and it was just important for me to just go back to the basics and do what I knew how to do best. So the 3 major things that we're looking for inside of a case interview is assessing a candidate's poise and communication skills. How are you working collaboratively with your interviewers is very important. And that's going to help you out when you come on and then you're handling these client relationships. You're going to have to do the same type of thing, and being poised and relaxed and communicating effectively is number one. Second, ambiguity in data issues. So are you able to look at the problem from different angles? And then also, are you able to understand that although there is a lot of data available, which one or how much of that data is actually relevant to what you're trying to do? And then how much can you actually get done in the time that you're given? And the last piece is probably one of the most important pieces is your analytical skills. So we're looking to evaluate a candidate's analytics and structuring. How do you set yourself up? And then, how quickly are you able to think on your feet? And also, are you able to develop solutions for clients that is data-driven? Data is ultimately what gives us credibility when we're on a client site, because numbers don't lie, basically. So when we actually show a client a solution, it's usually backed up by data. And that way we can say there's a reason why we came up to this solution, and there's logical rationale as to how we got there. One important piece on this page on the bottom left, so just interviewers look for many qualities, but the most important is the ability to think logically and communicate effectively. Make sure that you're thinking about that as you go along. A lot of people speak really, really fast, and just make sure you take your time to do that. So next page. So a couple of things. So what is a case interview? So a case interview gives us a chance to see how you're able to solve ambiguous business problems. It means, are you able to solve a problem that has many answers, and are you able to reach that solution in a way that makes sense? Are you asking for the right data? And then are you setting yourself up for success by developing frameworks that make sense in order to get to that ultimate solution? So one thing to note here, again, I'm going to hit these points on a high level, but the deck will be sent out, and you can talk a little bit more in detail during the Q&A if you have any questions. So the first bucket here is situation, trigger, and problem. Understanding what's the background, what's the context, and then ultimately, what are we trying to solve, right? So we want to understand how do we get here, what caused us to actually have this problem, and then we can move on to the framework, which is the second bucket, which is once we understand what we're really trying to answer, then we can start to work with our interviewer to structure our problem in a way that we'll be able to answer it. Similar to like a profitability case, you're going to be looking at sales, you're going to be looking at costs, and then basically what, based off the question, how do we actually align that in a way that makes sense? Once you're able to do that, then you're going to be asking for data, and then you'll be going to the meat of the issue or the case interview, which is the data collection and analysis, where that's where you're going to spend most of your time of just finding out, any insight that you can based off the numbers that you were given, based off of what you requested. And then also during that time, making sure you're bouncing back and forth with your interviewer, asking them questions as you go along, and just making sure you're walking them through the process of the numbers that you're using and how you're getting to your ultimate solution, which is the last area, and that'll be your recommendations. And that's where you're going to say, hey, based off of what we talked about earlier, steps 1 through 3, this is my solution that I'm coming up with. This is why I came up with it. And then this is how I'm justifying the ultimate solution and also risk that can be involved as well. Next page. Got the next one. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So the next few pages will be going into a bit of a double click into each of those areas that we spoke about before. Go back, please. So the first two are kind of in the same space just because they are ultimately what's going to set you up for success. You need to understand that like this portion of it is so important, and it's important that you make sure you take your time to think. And again, make sure you're working collaboratively with your interviewer to make sure that you're going in the right direction and you're guiding yourself correctly. You're going to want to spend about 1 to 2 minutes on each of these areas below, restating the question and clarifying your objectives of what you're trying to solve. A few more clarifying questions just to make sure that you're both aligned. And then you want to take some time out just to construct a model, construct your framework. So most of us, we're familiar with frameworks. It's important that you don't just go into it using like a boxed-in approach, and that you're also being a little bit more open to maybe combining a few different frameworks to get to a solution. And then once you've done that, you'll be able to develop a hypothesis, and you're going to develop an initial idea of what you're going to do going forward in order to solve the problem. Some things to consider for most candidates who are successful is they understand the question and clarify as necessary, because it's making sure that they're guiding themselves in the right way, and then also that they're receiving interviewer buy-in. This is an important piece because oftentimes interviewers will kind of give you a hint if you're going in the right direction or not by just like a little head nod or maybe a shake of the head. And it's important to kind of read those cues in order to know whether or not you're doing the right thing. Some things that, common mistakes in this portion is that that a candidate doesn't listen or manage the data. It's important, again, just to make sure that you're listening and that you're always asking questions and just going back to it. I think it's something that's overlooked, and sometimes we like to dive straight into the issue and not think about what other things we should consider. Next page. So once you've understood the problem, you've developed your framework, you're going to want to start collecting your data and start validating your hypothesis. So in the last step in the framework, you'd have already said, hey, I have this data, this is what I think is going to happen, or this is what I think the solution will be. Now you're going to use those numbers to kind of validate and say, hey, this backs up or actually it goes along with what I was initially thinking. Or this is also your moment to pivot and basically say, hey, this is my initial thinking, but now I'm starting to see as I'm going through the data that there may be another solution, and it's perfectly fine to pivot. Just make sure, again, you're talking with your interviewer and making sure that they understand where you were, where you're going, and why you switched in the first place. So some things for success in data collection and analysis, starts on a high level. So making sure you're starting with the bigger picture and then breaking your way down and then speaking about it clearly, communicating it effectively, back up. And then also listen for clues. So sometimes your interviewer will give you small little hints or, little nuggets here and there. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss some valuable information that can really help you answer a problem or come up with a great solution. Some common mistakes here is answers too quickly. So it's perfectly fine to take your time. Like I said, just make sure you're vocalizing that with your interviewer. Just saying, hey, you mind if I take the next few minutes, next 10 minutes or so, just to gather my thoughts, and then making sure that you're talking through with your interviewer as to, after 10 minutes is up, this is where I'm at, this is how much I think I still have to go. And the last section is, this is where you want to be, right? Your recommendation. So if you've made it this far, you've determined what the problem is, you've developed your model, you've come up with a hypothesis, you've validated it, and now this is your time to shine. So you're basically going to go through talking to your interviewer with how you got to your answer, and then you're going to synthesize your findings and articulate your solution with risk consideration. What that means is you're understanding that there's also a reality aspect of it, that most solutions aren't just actionable for a client to do, and it's not really that simple. There are going to be risk involved, and you'll also have to make sure that you're communicating those as well, saying, hey, these are some possible risks with my solution, but here are some ways that I think we can mitigate that and overcome those and ultimately get to something that will work favorably for our client. So a couple of areas of success for here is employs a strategic perspective. So are you looking at it in a way where you're saying like there's tactical steps in order to action this solution, or are you just basically giving a solution? And that goes over to one of the common mistakes, which is making one-dimensional recommendations and not understanding that there's maybe a timeline involved, there's some constraints that are involved, and making sure that you're also considering every aspect of what your solution will ultimately mean for the client, because that's what we do in real life. And I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Isaiah. Could we jump to the next slide, please? Awesome. So something we really want to reiterate here is that for us, the most important part of the case is not that you're getting the right answer or the exact, perfect formula for solving this problem. We're really looking to understand your logical framework and the process you're using so that we understand how you're thinking about structuring these problems. And so something we like to talk about is our hypothesis-driven approach. And so that's just a way for you to think about a way to build your issue tree. So what you'll be able to do is hear the case that you're being given and recognize that there's a problem that you're trying to solve. And then ask yourself, what's causing it? What are ideas that I have that might, be the reason that there's an issue here? And then as you move along, you'll be able to test that hypothesis. So that's a way for you to start setting up your issue tree. Think about something that might be the root cause of the problem that we're experiencing, and then start to think about a couple things that have to be true in order for that hypothesis to be correct. And that's going to set you up really well for next steps on then exploring and testing those different hypotheses. And it's going to allow you to form a really clear, data-driven recommendation that your interviewer clearly understands how you thought through from beginning to end. So I think that's a really strong way to think about a framework, is really hypothesis-driven. On the next slide, we should have a couple examples of different frameworks that you could think about for each case. So everyone's going to find the right framework that kind of works for them. But here are a couple ways that you could think about specific frameworks if you're given a case that focuses on a specific area of a company or a specific type of problem that they might have. So examples would include something like revenue growth. So in thinking about that, there's kind of two main ways that you could pursue that option, and that's through existing markets or new markets. And then from there, you can look at prices, new products, new countries, that sort of thing. Another example might be M&A. We're trying to figure out what the value of a company might be if we buy it or we merge with them. So things that we might think about for a hypothesis could be the intrinsic value of that company we're looking at acquiring. Or we could think about synergies, so ways that we're going to be more effective if we work together as one company. Cost reduction is another common case. That's a lot of the work that I've done at Kearney, so I love that sort of case. And you can kind of just think about the different ways that companies spend money and make money. So their OPEX costs, so the cost of doing business or actually building materials, or their CAPEX, the way that they finance things, the taxes that they're paying. Those could be key levers that you could pull to really explore opportunities for solving that problem. And then again, strategic sourcing, another awesome area, is more specific. It's how can sourcing spend specifically be reduced? And again, two main areas to look at, lowering the volume or lowering the prices. So this is just a couple ways for you to think about more specific frameworks for specific types of cases that you might hear. So on the next page, we have an example of what an issue tree might look like for a case where we're trying to look at a way to increase sales. So we can see here that someone very brilliantly thought through a couple main issues and broke it down into two major hypotheses. How can we increase the number of sales in total so we get customers to buy more? Or how to increase the number of customers so we have more people buying things? And I love this way of structuring your thinking because it's simple, it's clear, and we can go down either avenue or both, as needed depending on the case. And then within that issue, we come up with hypotheses. How do we change consumer demand? How do we think about customer mix? And then within each hypothesis, we have questions we come up with for how we're actually going to test it. And so again here, the idea is we just want to understand how you're structuring your thinking and see that you can set up really clear and logical frameworks. So something I'll really emphasize here is we want to make sure that you are speaking out loud as you do this work. So, you'll draw your issue tree, but make sure that you're also practicing presenting how you share that information with your interviewer. And as you're kind of moving through the process, you can kind of refer back to it to show that you're really you've got your head on the overall goal, but you're showing the logical progression of your thinking. And so I know that talking out loud as you do this can be a little awkward, but the more you speak out loud, the better we can follow your thought process and understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish here. So I think that's super helpful. And then I think we've just got one more slide. Just on notes. So again, virtual interviews are, I think, still a great way. We've been doing it for a while, and so it's something that we're, ready to do. But it's important that you keep notes that are really well structured. And so what we'd recommend is that you use 3 sheets of paper. Graph paper, if you have it, is just a really clean way to keep track of things. And then that you turn your sheets horizontal like PowerPoint slides, because you're going to get a lot of practice with those. And so on one sheet, you might have something about the objective, some of your key questions, so that you're able to refer back to your original thinking. You might have another sheet of paper for your actual framework that you've laid out that we just kind of went over an example of. And then the third page might be where you have more of your specific notes as the case is ongoing or where you're doing any sort of calculation. And that should be a really easy way for you to be able to follow all of the brilliant thinking that you've been doing and be able to arrive at a logical conclusion. So I hope that was a helpful overview. I know we ran through a lot of information pretty quickly, but we'd love to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you all so much. Definitely really great information about the interview process. We are getting a lot of questions, and so keep sending them to Emily Peer. We'll try to get to as many as possible. I want to ask the first question, and again, I think any one of you could answer this, but how would you think most interviewers would react to small math errors, and how maybe do you course correct if that happens? And I'll leave that to anybody.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So I think with math, I mean, small errors, it's not a big deal. You just want to make sure that you go back and fix it, and don't get too panicked. Don't worry about it too much. I also tell candidates to make sure that every time you approach a math problem, discuss how you're going to solve it, what you're trying to get to, how you're going to solve it first. Make sure it makes sense to the interviewer, and then jump down into the calculations. The reason for this is that if you just start doing math right away, and I as an interviewer, I can't really follow what you're doing, it's not really clear, and then you get to the wrong number at the end of it, it's hard to tell if it was because you had an arithmetic error or if you had an error in your structure. So it's much better to verify this is, I'm trying to get to the overall size of the market. I'm going to do step 1, step 2, step 3. Does that make sense with you? Get the sign off and then go jump into that calculation, because then if you get the wrong number, you know that it was a math mistake and it wasn't a logic mistake.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that one. The next question that we have, and again, this is open to anybody, is about brainstorming questions. So do you expect the interviewees to shoot off a list of brainstormed ideas in a structured way, but without time to think, or take some time to pause for a couple minutes and think it through? So what would you say that maybe we would prefer in the interview process?
I could take this. So I think it's best practice to listen to the case prompt and then tell your interviewer, I'd love a minute or two just to think about this, and structure your issue tree and start thinking about questions and really gather your thoughts so that you can then present that initial set of ideas or questions in a really logical, coherent way. So we don't expect you to be, nailing everything with absolutely no time, but again, just over communicate and tell your interviewer that you'd like a few minutes to gather your thoughts before you then present it to them.
And even just to hop on that, I think as you're hearing the prompt, if you're able to take down notes and just items that you want to clarify really quickly, or just quick questions that you want to ask immediately, I think that's also a good way to do it.
Great, thank you. Our next question is around, and Sarah, maybe you can take this one first, since you kind of talked about it a little bit with the virtual interviews, and then anybody else feel free to hop in. But what's the best way that you can work through the framework with your interviewer online? Would you suggest holding it up to the camera? You mentioned, some of the ways that you would use graph paper, but in a virtual environment, what are some good tips for the case portion?
Yeah, I absolutely hear that. And I think the first thing that I'll say is I think just speaking out loud a lot is the best way to convey your thoughts. Of course, I think the notes are really important, and your interviewer may want you to, flip your paper around and show it to them, and that's awesome, and that'll be a great way to show that you're a really organized note taker and show the really clear thinking that you have. But I think as much as possible, you're just going to be relying on vocal cues to really convey your thinking and framework. Something else that you might be able to do is really use hand gestures really, I think, carefully. So, for example, if you want to ask like 3 questions, like you can kind of do that. Or maybe if you're structuring your ask, you can say, this is where I want to start, here's next, something like that. So I think, we're all kind of trying to figure out what works best, but those would be a couple strategies that I would use to be a really effective communicator virtually.
Awesome. Anybody else with any tips? Okay. Well, thank you for that, Sarah. We're going to move on to another question here, and this is about practicing cases. So again, what would you guys recommend is a good, how many cases would you recommend practicing, and also what are some resources that your go-to resources for practicing cases?
Yeah, I can quickly speak to this one. So I recently was helping a few different candidates with their case interview process, and I would say do as many as you can. It's not, I don't think there's like a number, because I don't remember how many I did before mine, but I think the important piece is, again, what everybody's mentioning is understand just the major parts that you need to do. You need to structure your problem. You need to communicate effectively. Like when you're practicing with someone, make sure that they're holding you accountable to just speak through everything. And a way that you can test that is something that I've heard often since I've been a consultant is what I'm explaining, could I explain it to my mother and would she understand? Like, so when you're communicating with somebody, are they able to quickly understand, or do they have that face of confusion? So it's like, even if you're practicing with your friend or if you're practicing with someone at school, like make sure that everything that you're saying, they understand, like, how did you get there? What did you do to get there? What are the numbers that you got there? So I would say just in that sense, I would focus more on my structure than I would like the number of cases that I did. It was more like, am I consistently communicating in a way that makes sense? Am I consistently getting to a solution? And am I consistently thinking of other solutions that may not be common? And am I thinking outside of the box, but also working within a time constraint? So I would think about it more that way than the quantity. Definitely more quality. In terms of like best practices, I don't have like a website that I use, but I would literally Google like case interview questions, and then also just utilize people that were around me. Like, hey, think of a question like how many tennis balls can I fit into an airplane, or like just something random. And oftentimes you'll find that those random questions actually starts to like develop your mind to think outside of the box. And once it gets to the point where you're having fun, then you like reached the step that you're ready. But again, quality over quantity, and I'll leave it at that.
That was a great answer. I appreciate that one, and I think that kind of it speaks to all the things that you guys have all gone through, and so you're giving the real tips to the students here. So my next question for you guys is about data. So do we sometimes have to assume that data that the interviewer won't tell us and would wait for us to ask it? So if you guys could speak to what that might look like during the interview process, and if that is something that happens.
Yes, definitely. There's no case where we're saying here's the problem and here's all the data right at the beginning at the same time. I mean, there's always data in the case, and you do have to ask for it. And I think to all the great points that Sarah and Isaiah talked about earlier, you want to make sure that you have a structured reasoning for the data that you're asking. So you're not just like grasping for questions like, oh, do we have this? Do we have this? You want to be like, okay, so what I'm trying to get at is I want to size the market. And so I'm trying to understand how many competitors there are there. Trying to understand like how long our client's been in there, if they've had growing market share. So do we have any information on that? Like, don't just start asking for random pieces of data without justifying why you're doing it. Because then me as an interviewer, like I would just start giving you really short answers and like be like, oh, no, or it's about this. But like if you are explaining that logic, that thought process, then you'll very quickly get the data that you need to progress the case and get to the analysis and fun portion of it.
Great answer. Our next question that we have is about how do interviewees remain conversational with the interviewer while still being able to drive the case?
I can like quickly speak to that. I think it's about like your level of comfortability is going to be noticeable. Like I think I'm not an interviewer myself, but just like in my interview, how I kind of kept it conversational was I was comfortable. Like I made sure like I understood what the purpose of it was and structuring it and just understanding that like being collaborative is so important because that's what we do in our everyday work. It's like you have to constantly speak with your team. You have to constantly talk to them about your problems and how you're going to set it up. And oftentimes or many times they may not agree, but then you can have that conversation of like, okay, where do you think that I'm going in the right direction? Where do you think I'm going in the wrong direction? And how do we kind of change that? But if you understand, like if you do not keep it conversational, you can kind of go back to what Alex said, and like you'll end up running off in a direction, and they're like, well, now you've ran this way, I have to pull all the way back here in order to like redirect you in the right direction. So it's important just to be calm and just like speak, like be yourself. Like that's what you should also practice when you're practicing with your friends. Like practice just talking in a normal tone, keeping a normal pace, being not too slow, not too fast, whatever that means. I know it's like it's very subjective, but it's more just being like in a calm space and kind of like what we do in our everyday when we present is just being really transparent and also just like you can smile too, you know that, right? Like during a case interview, you don't have to be like a robot. No one likes a robot. I don't like a robot. Interviewers don't like a robot. Like you don't like a robot as your friend. Like just keep that in mind when you're in there of being a human first and attacking the case in a way that makes sense.
I also found it really helpful when I was interviewing to practice with different people just to get that level of comfort. So even if somebody you're not as close to or things like that, just hearing their opinion and doing things with them sort of allows you to get practiced in that sense of comfort. And if certain things throw you off, you're able to hear that and make sure that you keep your calm and keep your cool.
And if I could piggyback off of that, as far as conversational stuff, I think particularly if it's a case where you can imagine yourself as a consumer, so it's like a B2C, it helps to just bring that into it. Like if you have a grocery store case, a pharmacy case, a travel case, like you've been the customer in each one of those experiences. And so if you can be like, oh yeah, when I'm like, going through this experience, like these are the things that I look for. Like I know that my friends are focused on this. Like it helps turn it into a little bit more of a conversation. Now, not all cases lend the ability to do that, but I think that whenever you can draw those personal ties and show that aspect of it, it's going to make the case more interesting for yourself and your interviewer.
Great, thank you all for that. I think we have time for one more question, and I want to give you all the opportunity to answer this. We talked a lot about tips and tricks, I think, for both behavioral and case, but if you all could give your one tip and trick that you think is the most important for you to everyone, I think that would be great.
I can start us off. So I think a lot of the questions were more towards the case interview, which is understood because it's oftentimes the one that people are most worried about. But just going back to the behavioral, I think Alex hit the nail on the head with all of his points. I'll just add utilize the fact that you're in a virtual interview. like something that I did was I had my resume next to me during my first interview, which happened to be virtual as well. And I would literally just write down like, this is a situation where I had to do multiple projects, or this is a situation where I had to, work by myself, or like just different behavioral questions that you think may come up. You can literally write that on your resume and have that next to you. And it's like, don't see it as cheating. It's like, it's just an opportunity for you to kind of like not have to pull things out of thin air. And it's more like, you'll be prepared, and it helps out a lot just to have that there with you.
I think I'll go next for the case interview. I think even if you get a math question wrong, or you feel like one of your answers wasn't exactly hit on the head, don't beat yourself up about it. It happens to everyone, and it's like a human mistake. And so I think just staying calm and being collected and having your thoughts all in order are really good tips. And it's hard sometimes in practice, but really just striving towards that and making sure that you feel at a place where you're confident in what you're saying, I think is the ideal goal.
All right, I'm happy to go next. My biggest piece of advice, if you're someone who gets a little bit anxious for interviews like I am, everyone's like, oh, just stay calm, but you can tell yourself that, and the interview starts, and it's really, really difficult to just stay calm. So my piece of advice is just remember that the people that are interviewing want you to succeed, and they're excited to talk to you. We love our jobs, but generally speaking, like spending a day in interviews is exciting. It's different. It's something that we all look forward to, and it's a great experience for us when we see, a candidate that is telling their experience and their story really well, that is getting into the case and enjoying the problem solving, and then we really enjoy that experience. So just know that we are rooting for you. We want to talk to you, and we're not trying to be scary or mean or make it be a not great experience for you.
I'll close it out, I think, with Trisha. I might give two pieces of advice, if that's okay.
That's okay.
Oh my gosh. So I think tactically, speaking about frameworks, I recommend you practice a lot and you find a pattern. So you find one framework or a series of frameworks that work really well for you, and you can do it in your sleep. Like, for example, as I started doing a lot of case studies, I found that in almost every situation, it made most sense to me to break things down into internal and external hypotheses. That's just what worked for me. You can find what works for you, but I would just get really comfortable with a pattern or a framework that you just know that you're going to nail, because you're going to go in more confident and you're going to be able to be prepared for any sort of case that comes your way. So that would be my tactical advice. And then I think my second piece of advice would be to just remember that you're all amazing. Like, this is a really crazy fall we've got going on, and we are so grateful that you're here. We're so grateful that you're wanting to come to Kearney, and I just remember that before you go in. Like, we think you're wonderful. You should think you're wonderful. And I think it's going to be a really great experience because our team has done this for a while. We know how to do it, and I think it's going to be a really great process for all of us.
That's an awesome piece of advice to end on. And yes, we have done this before, so hopefully this will make you guys feel more comfortable doing all these virtual. We really appreciate you joining us this evening, and thank you so much to the panelists for answering all these questions. If there are any questions that we didn't answer, again, you can send those to careers.ug@kearney.com, and we'll do our best to answer those. But good luck this fall, and we will talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Have a good one. Bye.
Thanks.